The first time anyone in Riverton claimed to have seen Luther Ashford was in the early winter of 1862, when the frost had hardened the mud of the Susquehanna's banks and the wind carried the smell of wood smoke from one end of the valley to the other. A boy named Samuel Denton found him lying in the hayloft of the Miller barn, curled like a sleeping animal. His boots perfectly clean despite the snow outside, his face untouched by the cold. Samuel swore later that the man's eyes opened before he spoke his name. 2 words, nothing more, and that they were the clearest, palest gray he had ever seen. But what Samuel remembered most was that he'd seen those same eyes once before, 20 years earlier, staring from a crowd during the flood of 1842. They were exactly the same, not older, not changed. When Dr. Elias Whitcomb was summoned, he expected the usual, a vagrant, drunk, perhaps delirious. But as he climbed the barn ladder and looked down at the man on the straw, he felt something shift in the air, like the silence after a bell has stopped ringing. Luther Ashford rose without help, his posture as straight as a soldier's, and extended a hand as if greeting an old friend. "Doctor," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "It's been some time." Whitcomb frowned. They had never met. "Before we go further, I need you to do something for me. If you want more stories like this, accounts the official records refuse to keep, like this video, share it, subscribe, and press the bell icon. Because what you're about to hear is drawn from sealed ledgers and missing testimonies, and the more people who see it, the harder it becomes for this history to disappear." Back in the barn, Luther Ashford submitted to an examination without protest. His skin was cool to the touch, his pulse slow and steady, but his breathing was shallow in a way Whitcomb couldn't explain. No injuries, no frostbite, no sign of exposure. And yet Luther spoke as if he had walked a very long way. His sentences measured, his eyes always fixed just past Whitcomb's shoulder, as if watching something move in the dark behind him. When asked where he had come from, Luther simply said, "I've been here before." Whitcomb, unsettled, decided against leaving him in the care of the Miller family. Instead, he led him to the town infirmary, a 2-story brick building with 6 beds and a wood-burning stove that clanged in the night. The nurse on duty, Margaret Phelps, recorded that he never removed his coat, even to sleep, and that he spent hours standing at the window, looking out toward the river. By the second day, whispers had spread through Riverton. Old Mrs. Dobbins claimed she had seen Luther in 1832, helping carry sandbags during the spring thaw, unchanged. A retired ferryman swore the man had once paid him in a coin so old it crumbled in his palm. None of them could explain why his face had not aged a day in 30 years. Whitcomb began keeping a private ledger of the case. The first entry, dated December 3, 1862, described Luther's peculiar resistance to cold and the absence of any signs of illness. He noted that the man's hair, though dark, showed no trace of gray despite an apparent age of 35 or more. Under a hastily drawn line, he wrote, "Patient gives impression of memory extending beyond his years, unsettlingly so." The nights in Riverton were long and still, broken only by the creak of the infirmary's timbers as they shifted in the frost. Margaret Phelps noticed that Luther's eyes seemed to adjust too quickly when lamps were lit, as if his vision adapted faster than human eyes should. Once, she swore she saw him standing in the hallway before she had even opened the door to let him through. On the 5th day, Whitcomb decided to test him. In casual conversation, he referenced events from the war, skirmishes, political speeches, military orders, some of which had occurred months ago, others yet to take place. Luther answered each with the precision of a man who had witnessed them, never hesitating, never second-guessing. And when Whitcomb asked how he could know these things, Luther only smiled faintly and said, "You'll remember me when it matters." By then, the town's patience had thinned. Riverton was a place that mistrusted outsiders in peacetime and feared them in war. The Civil War had divided Pennsylvania's loyalties, and a stranger with uncanny knowledge and an unchanging face was bound to draw suspicion. Some whispered he was a Confederate spy. Others said he was cursed, a harbinger of death. One night, a group of men from the north end of town came to the infirmary with the intention of driving Luther out. Whitcomb intercepted them at the door, insisting the man was under his medical care. Luther, hearing the commotion, stepped into the hallway. His presence stilled them instantly. One man later told his wife that it was not what Luther said. It was the way he looked at them, as if he already knew the date and manner of each of their deaths. They left without another word. On the 10th day, Whitcomb found Luther seated at the desk in his examination room, leafing through an old almanac. The book had belonged to Whitcomb's father, printed in 1810, its pages yellowed and brittle. Luther traced the dates on the calendar with a fingertip, murmuring names and events that had no place in that decade. Some were familiar: historic battles, fires, floods. Others were not yet known to Whitcomb. The collapse of a bridge in 1889, the sinking of a ship called the Carrickmore in 1904. When Whitcomb pressed him for an explanation, Luther closed the almanac and said, "I have been walking this road longer than you've been alive, and I have seen it all before." That night, Whitcomb wrote in his ledger, "This is not illness. This is not madness. This is something I have no name for, but names would come, given by others, whispered in the years to follow. Some would call him a prophet, others a ghost, and still others would say he was something far worse, something that moved through the decades not as a witness, but as an architect. In the weeks ahead, the town of Riverton would learn that Luther Ashford had no intention of leaving, and that his presence was not the beginning of a mystery, but the continuation of one that had already spanned lifetimes. And for Dr. Whitcomb, who had prided himself on a career built on facts and remedies, the man in the infirmary bed would become the first patient who refused to fit inside the boundaries of science. The ledger's second entry, written in a tighter, more deliberate hand, ended with a single sentence: "If time does not change him, what will?" The snow thickened over Riverton in the days that followed, layering rooftops and silencing the streets. Inside the infirmary, Luther Ashford moved with the same unhurried calm, never showing discomfort in the cold, never asking for extra blankets. Margaret Phelps began to note something stranger. His habits had no rhythm. He would remain still for hours, then suddenly rise, cross the room, and touch a single object. Sometimes the window latch, sometimes the iron bed frame, as if confirming its place in the world. When asked why, he would say only, "To see if it's changed." By mid-December, Whitcomb had abandoned any pretense of casual observation. He began conducting formal interviews, recording Luther's responses in his private ledger. One session began with a simple question: "How old are you?" Luther tilted his head, as though amused. "Do you mean in years or in lives?" When Whitcomb pressed for clarity, Luther replied, "Years are for those who move in one direction." The answer unsettled Whitcomb enough to switch topics. He asked about Luther's earliest memory. Without hesitation, Luther described a spring morning in the year 1794, standing on a bluff overlooking a river swollen from snowmelt. He named the river, a small one in western Pennsylvania that had long since been dammed. He named the family who lived nearby, the color of their barn, and the name of their eldest daughter. Whitcomb recognized none of it, but when he checked an old county register in the archives, the details matched. The family had died in a fever outbreak that same year. Margaret, though wary of Luther, could not shake a certain pull toward him. One night, while stoking the stove, she asked him outright if he had been here before, meaning Riverton, meaning this time. "Yes," he said softly, watching the flames, "and I will be here again." On the 14th day, Whitcomb invited Reverend Silas Hodge to meet Luther, hoping the clergyman might offer some moral insight where medicine failed. Hodge arrived with a Bible under his arm, his manner cautious but not unkind. He spoke to Luther of sin, salvation, and the brevity of life. Luther listened patiently before asking, "What if life is not brief at all, Reverend? What if it is the longest thing we do?" Hodge tried to remind him of divine judgment, but Luther interrupted with a question of his own. "If a man remembers every mistake, every loss for centuries, is that not judgment enough?" The conversation shook the Reverend. Later, in private, he told Whitcomb that Luther's words had the weight of confession, though to crimes committed in times beyond living memory. By Christmas Eve, Riverton's curiosity had shifted toward suspicion once again. The war was entering its second winter, and news from the front was grim. Families gathered close, avoiding strangers. Yet Luther, walking the town's streets in his long coat, seemed to be met with wary distance rather than outright hostility. Children stared at him, whispering about his pale eyes. More than one shopkeeper claimed he knew their prices before they spoke them, or that he commented on past owners who had been dead for decades. It was during one of these walks that Luther stopped before the shuttered window of the old Harriman house, vacant since a fire in '49. A young man passing by heard him speak under his breath, "Still here." When the man asked what he meant, Luther replied, "The sound of her voice. It's still here." Whitcomb began to consider whether Luther's condition, if it could be called that, was not physical at all, but something tied to memory. Not the ordinary recollection of one's life, but a memory that seemed to encompass entire generations, as if time had layered itself upon him rather than carrying him forward. One evening, determined to learn more, Whitcomb presented Luther with objects from different decades: a child's shoe from 1815, a rusted Union cavalry insignia, a scrap of fabric from a dress dated to 1847. Luther handled each as though reacquainting himself with an old friend. When Whitcomb asked if he recognized them, he answered, "Not the objects, but the days they came from." Then he described, in vivid detail, a rainstorm that had swept the valley in the summer of 1815, the way the sky had darkened so suddenly that the livestock panicked and broke their pens. Margaret, who was listening, whispered, "You weren't even born then." Luther turned to her. "Do you remember the first time you fell ill as a child? The taste of the water they gave you? The sound of your mother's shoes in the hallway? I do. Not just mine. Everyone's." The remark chilled the room. Whitcomb wrote in his ledger that night, "Subject implies a form of total recall extending beyond his own lifetime. Unclear whether this is delusion or a reality beyond current understanding." Days stretched into weeks. The river froze over, the ice groaning under its own weight. Luther began rising earlier, standing at the infirmary's front door before sunrise, as though expecting someone. When Whitcomb asked who, Luther replied, "The one who remembers me." No such person appeared. It was during the final week of January that a local widow named Clara Jensen came to the infirmary, trembling. She insisted she had known Luther as a young girl in 1820, when he had boarded with her family for a winter. He had looked exactly the same then as he did now. Whitcomb, skeptical, asked her to describe something about that winter that Luther could confirm. Without hesitation, she said, "The yellow scarf." Luther smiled faintly and said, "It was your mother's. She wore it when she met your father." Clara burst into tears. This incident made its way through Riverton by nightfall, and by morning the infirmary saw a steady trickle of townsfolk claiming some fleeting memory of the man from years, sometimes decades, past. Many of these stories conflicted in time and place, yet each insisted on the same unchanged face, the same pale eyes. Whitcomb's ledger entries became more urgent. Pattern emerging. Subject appears in multiple lifetimes of same community. No sign of aging between appearances. No verifiable birth record. If accurate, implications catastrophic to established natural law. By early February, Margaret confessed to Whitcomb that she had begun dreaming of Luther. In these dreams, she was a different person, sometimes older, sometimes younger, yet always standing in the same place, the riverbank in winter, Luther beside her. He never spoke, but always looked out over the ice, as if waiting for something to break through. When she mentioned this to Luther, he simply nodded and said, "Yes, you've been there." That same night, Whitcomb caught Luther in the examination room, leaning over the ledger. The doctor had locked it in his desk drawer, but the lock was untouched, as though it had never been turned. Luther was reading an entry dated only hours earlier. He looked up and said, "You'll keep writing, Elias. Even when I'm gone, you'll keep writing." The doctor's hands trembled. He had not told Luther his first name. It was then Whitcomb realized that whatever Luther Ashford was, he was not a man who had merely lived a long time. He was something threaded through the fabric of Riverton itself, woven into its winters and its river ice, its births and its deaths. And if he had walked here before, he would walk here again, long after every witness, every skeptic, and every believer had been laid beneath the snow. Whitcomb's final entry for that month was brief, written in an unsteady hand. If his life is not measured in years, then what is the measure? And how many measures remain before it is ours? The thaw came early that year, as though the river itself had grown restless. Ice, fractured with sharp reports, floating downstream in jagged slabs that turned the water into a field of moving glass. Luther Ashford watched it daily from the infirmary window, hands clasped behind his back, his posture perfectly still. Margaret noted that he seemed more alert now, as if the breaking ice marked the approach of something he had been expecting all along. One morning, just after sunrise, Luther asked Whitcomb for a walk along the riverbank. The doctor hesitated. Luther had never requested to leave the infirmary before, but agreed, curious to observe him outside the confines of the building. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of thawing earth. Luther stepped carefully, pausing often to watch the water. At one point he stopped entirely, staring at a half-submerged branch caught in the current. "It's here again," he said. Whitcomb asked what he meant. Luther didn't look at him. The same branch, every time. The doctor tried to rationalize. Branches break loose from trees every year, but Luther's voice had the calm certainty of someone recognizing an old friend. "It caught there in 1812. I remember the shape of the split. The ice swallowed it then, and here it is." That night, Whitcomb wrote in his ledger, "Subject appears to perceive continuity of events across decades, as if time loops rather than passes. Implies cyclical rather than linear experience of reality." By mid-March, word of Luther's peculiar knowledge spread beyond Riverton. A newspaperman from Harrisburg arrived, claiming interest in writing a human interest piece about the man who remembers too much. Whitcomb refused him an interview, but Margaret caught the stranger loitering outside the infirmary, sketching Luther's silhouette through the frosted glass. She told Luther about it later, expecting annoyance. Instead, he only said, "Let them write." Words fade faster than faces. That remark lodged in Margaret's thoughts. She began noticing that Luther avoided looking at photographs or painted portraits, as though they were irritants. When she pressed him on it, he said, "They pretend to keep the past, but they lose the sound, the warmth. They are corpses of moments." In late March, an unexpected visitor arrived. A man named Edgar Mallory, gaunt and sharp-eyed, who claimed his grandmother had spoken of Luther often. She had described him as a boarder in their house during the winter of 1798. Mallory brought with him a small wooden box carved with initials. "She said you gave her this," Mallory told Luther. Luther opened the box and inside found a dried sprig of lavender. He touched it lightly, and for a moment his otherwise unreadable face softened. "She wore this in her hair the day she told me her husband would not return from sea," he said quietly. Mallory stared in disbelief. The story had been passed down in his family, but never told to anyone outside it. After Mallory left, Whitcomb confronted Luther directly. "Are you claiming you were alive in 1798? "I am claiming I was here," Luther answered. "Whether you call that alive is your choice." The doctor felt a creeping dread. He realized that Luther never spoke of birth or death in personal terms, only of presence and absence, as if he stepped in and out of Riverton's timeline like a room he could enter at will. April came with a surge of rain, swelling the river until it lapped at the banks. Luther seemed to grow quieter, speaking less each day. Margaret found him one night standing barefoot in the courtyard, staring at the sky as water dripped from the eaves. "It's almost time," he murmured. She asked for what, but he did not answer. The following week, a child went missing in Riverton, a girl named Eliza Hart, last seen playing near the old mill. The town erupted into frantic search parties, lanterns bobbing in the darkness. Luther joined one of the groups without being asked, his long stride keeping pace with the younger men. He led them down a narrow, overgrown path toward the river. "She will be here," he said, with quiet certainty. They found the girl at the water's edge, shivering but unharmed, clutching a small wooden toy. When asked how she had gotten there, she said simply, "The man told me to wait for him. He said he'd be right back." The description she gave matched no one in town, except Luther. Suspicion flared. Some whispered that he had lured her there, others that he had been watching children for weeks. Whitcomb defended him, arguing that Luther had helped find the girl, but doubt had already taken root. Margaret confronted Luther privately, her voice shaking. "Did you speak to her before we found her?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Not this time." The words chilled her more than a denial would have. By May, the town's unease became open hostility. Parents forbade their children from approaching the infirmary. The Harrisburg newspaperman returned with 2 companions, pressing for details. Whitcomb turned them away again, but not before overhearing one mutter, "They'll burn him out eventually." That same night, Luther appeared at Margaret's door in the staff quarters. He handed her a folded scrap of paper. Inside was a sketch, not of her as she was, but of a much younger woman in an unfamiliar dress, standing on a snowy riverbank. "This is you," he said, "from the first time we met." Margaret stared at the drawing. She had no memory of it, yet the expression on the woman's face felt uncomfortably familiar. "When was this?" she asked. "Long before you were Margaret," Luther replied. The next morning, Whitcomb found his ledger missing. He tore the infirmary apart in search, finally discovering it on the examination table, open to a blank page. Written in unfamiliar ink, in a hand not his own, was a single line. "Some measures cannot be recorded." Summer approached, and with it came an oppressive heat. Luther began taking long walks after dark, slipping out without notice and returning before dawn. Margaret followed him once, keeping to the shadows. He walked to the riverbank, where mist clung low over the water. There he stood, speaking softly into the fog, as if addressing someone she could not see. She could not make out the words, but she swore she heard a second voice answer. When she told Whitcomb, he urged her to stay away from Luther entirely. "We don't know what he is," the doctor said, "and I'm starting to believe we never will." By the end of June, Riverton was ready to drive Luther out. A meeting at the town hall ended in heated argument. Some insisted he had saved Eliza Hart, others claimed he had been the one to put her in danger. When word of the meeting reached the infirmary, Luther simply said, "It always ends this way." On the last day of the month, Whitcomb awoke to find Luther's bed empty. His few belongings, a coat, a pair of gloves, were neatly folded on the chair. On the pillow lay a dried sprig of lavender, identical to the one in Mallory's box. Margaret found him later that morning, standing at the edge of the river. The water was low now, the branch from months before long gone. He turned to her and said, "It's time to be absent." Before she could answer, he stepped into the water, walking steadily until the current closed over his head. They searched downstream for days, but no body was ever found. By mid-July, the townsfolk spoke of Luther Ashford only in hushed tones, as if saying his name might call him back. Whitcomb closed the infirmary's ledger for the last time, his final note written in an unsteady hand. If absence is his death, then death is not enough to keep him. And in the years that followed, when the river froze and the ice began to crack, a few swore they saw a lone figure on the bank, pale-eyed, still, waiting for something only he could see. The winter of 1863 arrived with a violence that seemed almost deliberate. Snow fell in relentless sheets, piling against doors and windows until Riverton felt buried alive. The river froze over in a matter of days, its surface hard and white under the pale glow of the moon. By then, Luther Ashford had been gone 6 months. No trace of him had surfaced, not a body, not a possession washed ashore, nothing to prove that he had drowned at all. People stopped speaking of him openly, but his absence had not diminished his presence. Children dared one another to walk past the infirmary at night, swearing they saw pale eyes watching from the upper windows. A farmer claimed to have found strange footprints in the snow near his barn, bare feet, no shoes, no socks, leading toward the river and disappearing at its edge. He said the prints were warm enough to steam against the frost. Margaret tried to dismiss these stories, but she too felt him in ways she couldn't explain. Some nights she woke certain that someone had been standing in her room, though the door was bolted. In those moments she would smell a faint trace of lavender, sharp and unmistakable. Whitcomb had grown increasingly reclusive since Luther's disappearance. He rarely ventured into town, and when he did, he avoided meeting anyone's eyes. His health began to decline. A persistent cough racked him, and his hands trembled when he wrote. The ledger remained locked away in his office, yet Margaret sometimes heard the sound of pages turning late at night, even when Whitcomb was asleep. It was in early February, during one of the coldest weeks of the year, that the first letter arrived. It bore no return address, only Margaret's name in precise, slanted handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, unlined, with a date written at the top, March 12, 1887. Beneath it were only 6 words, "The branch will be there again." Margaret stared at the date. It was 24 years in the future. She brought the letter to Whitcomb, who read it twice before folding it carefully and locking it in his desk. "Don't speak of this to anyone," he told her. "It will only invite questions we cannot answer." But the letters continued. One arrived each month, always postmarked from a different town along the Susquehanna River, and always written in the same hand. Some contained brief, cryptic observations. "The girl will choose the blue ribbon. Do not stand near the south window on April 4th, while others carried fragments of conversations Margaret had not yet had, but would later find herself speaking word for word. By the fourth letter, Margaret knew it was Luther. The precision of his phrasing, the strange calm in his words. It was the same voice she had heard on the riverbank the day he stepped into the water. In March, Riverton was visited by a traveling phrenologist, a man who claimed he could map the soul through the bumps and ridges of the skull. He set up in the town hall, offering readings for a small fee. On his second day, Margaret saw him speaking with Whitcomb in hushed tones. Later, she overheard Whitcomb mutter, "No anomalies," but no normalcy either. When she asked what he meant, he only shook his head. That spring, the river thawed early again, and there, lodged against the same bend as before, was the branch, its split identical, as though no time had passed since Luther first pointed it out. Margaret stood on the bank, staring at it for what felt like hours, her breath fogging in the cold air. When she returned to the infirmary, a new letter was waiting for her. It contained only 2 sentences. "You saw it. So did I." Whitcomb's health worsened through the summer. He grew feverish, and his thoughts wandered in and out of coherence. One night, in a lucid moment, he called Margaret to his bedside and pressed a small brass key into her palm. "When the time comes," he whispered, "you'll know which lock it opens." He died 3 days later. In the weeks following his death, Margaret sorted through his belongings. The ledger was gone, though she had not seen anyone remove it. She tried the key in every drawer and cabinet in the infirmary, but none fit. Eventually, she placed it in her apron pocket, where it remained, a constant weight against her hip. That autumn, Riverton suffered a rash of strange occurrences. Livestock were found dead in their pens without wounds or signs of struggle. A schoolhouse door was discovered standing wide open one morning, the floor inside coated in frost despite the warm weather. And on the night of the harvest fair, a young boy went missing for several hours, only to be found asleep beneath the old mill wheel, clutching a sprig of dried lavender. Margaret had received no letters for 2 months, and the silence gnawed at her. She began walking the riverbank at night, scanning the water for any sign of movement. It was on one such night in late October that she saw him. He was standing in the shallows, his clothes dry despite the water swirling around his calves. The moonlight caught his pale eyes, and for a moment she could not breathe. "Luther," she whispered. He tilted his head slightly as if listening to a distant sound. "It's not yet time," he said. She stepped forward, but he was gone, the water rippling where he had stood. The next morning, a letter was waiting on her doorstep. No envelope, no stamp, just folded paper, damp along the edges. "The key is not for a lock," it read. "It is for a day." That winter, Margaret carried the key everywhere, unsure what a day could mean. The river froze solid again, and Riverton braced for another long season. But Margaret found herself waiting, not for the thaw, not for spring, but for a moment she would recognize without explanation. When it came, she believed Luther would be there. Snow collapsed from rooftops in slow heavy sheets as the winter of 1864 loosened its grip. The town thawed and creaked like an old house waking up. Margaret took to wearing Whitcomb's brass key around her neck on a thin length of black ribbon, the metal cold against her skin. She checked it without meaning to, touching it when she poured coffee, when she turned down beds, When she stood at the infirmary window and watched the river test its edges, she kept thinking of Luther's line, "The key is not for a lock, it is for a day." The letters resumed in March, though they came irregularly now, as if posted from the pauses between breaths. One contained a piece of newsprint clipped from a Philadelphia sheet listing steamboat arrivals. Someone had circled a name in graphite, Carrickmore, and drawn an arrow to the date, May 12th. Beneath it, in that same slanted hand, "Do not stand on the North Pier when the horn sounds." The paper smelled faintly of brine and lamp oil. Margaret took the clipping to the station master, who told her a new packet line had begun running upriver. He couldn't imagine why anyone would warn her off a pier, least of all in Riverton, where a horn was an event like a Sunday sermon. Margaret said nothing, only folded the paper and tucked it beneath the key at her collar. A week before the date on the clipping, a stranger arrived in town claiming to be a surveyor for the county. He was careful and polite and asked too many questions about the river's depth near the old Harriman Bend. He introduced himself as Mr. Snow, a name that sat falsely on his tongue. Margaret noticed him because he stared at things the way Luther did, not to see what they were, but when. When she brought him hot tea at the boarding house, he asked after the infirmary, after Dr. Whitcomb's papers, after any unusual visitors these past 2 winters. She said the doctor was dead and the papers were burned, which was half a lie and half protection. Mr. Snow smiled without showing his teeth. On May 12th, the Carrickmore's horn announced itself across the water with a fog hum that carried into bone. Townspeople gathered like they always did, hats lifted, hands shading eyes. Margaret felt the key at her throat grow heavier, as if it had swallowed a stone. She stepped back from the North Pier without understanding why. The horn sounded again. The crowd pressed forward. A child slipped, a woman screamed. The pier gave way, timbers popping like knuckles. It folded into the river and took 7 people with it. Margaret saw Mr. Snow in the chaos, not shouting, not moving toward the edge, only watching the place where she had been about to stand. He lifted a hand as if to tip his hat to her. Later, when they counted the living, his name was not on any town ledger. He had not taken a room. No one recalled the color of his coat. That night, Margaret found a new letter on the infirmary steps, soaked through by river fog but legible. The key turned. You chose the day and left it closed. Beneath the line, a single lavender petal was pressed into the paper so thin it looked like a fingerprint. After the accident, Riverton treated the river with a new superstition. Men touched their caps when they crossed the bridge. Children recited rhymes without knowing where they'd learned them. The water felt watchful. Margaret worked through the days and wrote at night in a small notebook of her own, nothing like Whitcomb's methodical ledger, only impressions, times, the shapes of things she could not name. When she slept, she dreamed of Luther sitting on the edge of a bed that wasn't hers, in a room without windows, his coat dry and his boots clean, turning a key that made no sound. In June, a woman arrived carrying a carpet bag and a grief she wore openly. Her name was Henrietta Pike, a widow from York. She said she had come because letters addressed in a careful, slanted hand had told her to. The first told her to sell the house before the spring thunder. The second said she would find her husband's watch beneath the floorboard under the stove. She did. The third said to go to Riverton and ask for Margaret Phelps. It said you would know what to do next, Henrietta said, her fingers worrying the bag's leather. Margaret did not, of course, but she took the woman's hand and felt the same strange hum she had felt when Luther had looked at her the first time in the infirmary corridor, as if her bones were tuning. She gave Henrietta the spare bed in the staff room and sat with her while she cried herself empty. When the tears were done, they drank black tea and stared at the key on the ribbon. "He sends them like you," Henrietta whispered, as if sorrow were a kind of address. July brought heat that pushed open every window in town. The river slowed, thick as glass. Margaret worked until her palms blistered and then worked more. On the 12th night of that month, she woke to find the brass key warm against her chest, warmer than skin. She rose, dressed, and walked to the river without deciding to. On the near bank stood Luther Ashford, hat in his hand, eyes pale as the bottom of a winter sky. He looked no older, no altered, no more or less real. "You kept the day closed," he said. "I moved my feet," she answered, and her voice broke on the last word to her embarrassment. He nodded toward the water. "There's always a day you can close." She wanted to ask him if there was a day one could open, and what would pour through it, and whether he was poured or poorer. Instead, she said, "Why me?" "You listen." "To what?" "To the part that remembers." She laughed once, not because it was funny, but because the alternative was to cry again. "Is that what you are, a memory?" He tilted his head like he did when testing the air. "I am where it goes when it doesn't know what else to be." A small boat drifted by, empty, the oars stowed neat as punctuation. Margaret could hear the oar locks tick softly as the river nudged them. She thought of Whitcomb's last coherent sentence, the one about measures. "How long?" she asked. "Longer," he said. "Do you die?" "I'm absent." "Is there a difference?" "For me," he said, "not much." She wanted to hate him then, for the way he could step in and step out while the rest of them rotted properly in their graves. She wanted to hate him for the letters that saved some and did not save others, for the lavender that meant comfort to her and nothing to a mother at the pier. But hatred needed a person to stick to, and he was more weather than man. She could only brace herself and let him pass through. "Mr. Snow," she said, testing the name. "Was that you?" His eyes flickered, not quite a smile. Names are coats you can borrow when it's cold. He moved as if to leave, and she stepped forward without thinking, fingers closing around his wrist. His skin was not cold, not warm, only the temperature of the room you forget you're in. "Will you be here?" she asked. "When I'm old?" "I will be here," he said, "when you are someone else." She let go. He stepped back into the dark and was gone. Not into the river this time, only into the seam between lampglow and fog. She stood there until the sky began to pale. The key cooled on its ribbon and lay flat. In August, the county sent a man from Philadelphia to inquire about the pier collapse. He wore a lime green waistcoat and an expression that apologized for nothing. He asked practical questions and made impractical notes. When he had finished, he asked Margaret to sign a statement confirming times and distances. The document bore a heading she recognized from one of Luther's early almanac mutterings: Commonwealth Committee on Unusual Occurrences. She signed without comment and later wished she hadn't. Henrietta found work at the dressmaker's and moved into a small room above the shop. On a Friday afternoon, she visited the infirmary carrying a box wrapped in newspaper. Inside lay Whitcomb's ledger. She'd bought the box at a church auction, she said, and found the book in a hidden compartment beneath false bottom. Margaret opened to the last page written in Whitcomb's hand and felt the old ache open a little wider. Then she turned a page and found new handwriting. Her own. She had never written in it. The entry was dated 3 days from now. It read, "Do not let the boy follow the sound." "What boy?" Henrietta asked. They found out on the 3rd day. Thomas Denton, 10 years old, Samuel's younger brother. He had taken to putting his ear against the bridge posts and listening, claiming he could hear a horn underwater. Margaret caught him there at dusk, eyes half closed, as if dreaming on his feet. She knelt and took his face in her hands. "There are sounds that aren't for you," she said gently. "Let them pass by." He nodded once with the grave courtesy of children and ran home. That night, a letter. "Well done. Some measures are small and still save everything that can be saved." Autumn came with a coppery light that gilded everything that would soon die. Margaret stopped expecting the letters and read them when they came, like weather reports, helpful, unarguable, never personal. She wore the key, kept the ledger, and slept when sleep found her. On the last warm evening of September, she sat beside Henrietta on the steps of the infirmary and watched bats stitch the air. "Do you think he is kind?" Henrietta asked. "I think he is consistent," Margaret said. "Will we see him again?" "Yes." "When?" Margaret touched the ribbon at her throat. "On the day the key fits." They did not have to wait long. The first frost came early, painting the grass in a thin white bloom. At dawn, a horn sounded. Not the Carrickmore, not any boat the river knew. It was smaller, nearer, like the breath of some instrument you play without hands. The key warmed once. The ledger's ribbon slid from its page and fell open to a blank line where a date was not yet written. Margaret rose, buttoned her coat, and stepped into a morning that had already chosen itself. She did not know what door it would open, but she knew who would be standing on the other side, with clean boots and a borrowed name, ready to ask her to move her feet. By the early spring of 1863, the Ashford estate no longer resembled a home. It was more akin to a shrine, or perhaps a containment site, designed not to keep intruders out, but to keep something in. The hedges, once neatly trimmed, grew into thick, twisting walls that shielded the manor from the road. Heavy curtains sealed every window, blocking both the sunlight and the gaze of any passerby. Luther's condition, or transformation, as Dr. Halberg now called it, had entered a phase that could no longer be explained away by theories of hysteria, melancholia, or physical malady. The changes were too precise, too deliberate, as though some guiding intelligence were shaping him into something unrecognizable. The first sign that the situation had worsened came not from Luther himself, but from the environment around him. The servants complained of static in the air, of their hair standing on end when they passed certain rooms. The temperature in Luther's study fluctuated violently. One moment it was stifling hot, the next it was cold enough to frost the glass from the inside. On one occasion, when Halberg entered to check on his patient, the doctor found Luther seated at his desk, perfectly still, surrounded by dozens of open books, but not one of them in a language Halberg could identify. The texts were filled with characters like twisted letters, some curling into one another in seamless loops, others jagged and sharp as broken glass. When Halberg asked where these books had come from, Luther smiled faintly and said, "I remember them." There was no clarification, no elaboration, just the cryptic assertion that these texts were not something he had learned from another source. They were something he had known before he knew anything else. It was around this time that strange marks began appearing on Luther's skin. At first they looked like bruises, small and round, as though he had pressed against some unfamiliar object in his sleep. But within days the marks formed patterns, symmetrical and deliberate, snaking up his arms, across his chest, and even along his jawline. Halberg examined them closely and noted that they were not wounds at all, but a kind of pigmentation, as though his skin were rewriting itself. Under certain light, the marks shimmered faintly, like the surface of oil. The household staff began to thin. Some left in fear, citing the noises they heard at night. Slow, deliberate footsteps in hallways they knew were empty, or a low hum vibrating through the floorboards. Others left without explanation, their positions unfilled. Only a few remained, a maid named Eleanor, the housekeeper Mrs. Finch, and the stable hand who rarely ventured indoors. All of them avoided direct contact with Luther unless summoned, and even then, they approached with the same wary caution one might show to a chained animal. Mrs. Finch confided in Halberg one evening over tea that Luther no longer seemed to breathe when he slept. She had checked on him late one night after hearing a heavy thud in his room, fearing he had fallen, but when she opened the door, she found him lying on the bed, eyes open, unblinking, and utterly still. There was no rise or fall of his chest. She backed away slowly, and before she could close the door, his eyes shifted toward her without any movement of his head. She swore they reflected not the candlelight, but something much darker. Halberg, though a man of reason, could not deny his own growing unease. He began keeping meticulous records of Luther's behavior, noting down every deviation from the ordinary, times of day when Luther seemed absent or hyper-focused, changes in appetite, shifts in his voice. On several occasions, Halberg recorded that Luther would respond to questions before they were asked, as if plucking the thought directly from the doctor's mind. The more time Halberg spent in Luther's presence, the more he felt as though his own memories were becoming unreliable. He would forget the date, misplace his notes, or enter a room and find himself unable to remember why he had gone there. At first he blamed exhaustion, but the pattern grew undeniable. The erosion of memory was not random, it was selective. Certain events, particularly those involving Luther's more inexplicable behaviors, would fade from Halberg's recollection within hours, leaving only vague impressions behind. One day, while combing through old Ashford family records in the Manor's library, Halberg came across something deeply unsettling. In the personal journal of Luther's grandfather, dating back to 1809, there were brief entries about the return of the pattern, and the boy's eyes remembering what the man forgets. The language was fragmentary, almost delirious, but the implications were chilling. This was not the first time the Ashford family had produced someone like Luther. Halberg confronted Luther with this discovery. The young man listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Halberg pressed for answers, Luther finally spoke. "We are not born. We are returned." The words hung in the air like frost. Halberg felt a strange pressure in his skull, as though his mind were being pried open. Luther leaned forward slightly and added, "I think you've always known that." From that moment, Halberg's sense of control over the situation began to collapse. He found himself dreading visits to the estate, yet feeling compelled to return. His nights were plagued by dreams of corridors that stretched infinitely, of doors that opened into black voids, and of Luther standing at the far end, watching him without blinking. The dreams carried a strange consistency. Each time, Luther was closer when Halberg awoke. The townspeople had begun to whisper too. Word spread of a figure matching Luther's description seen walking the grounds at impossible hours, appearing in one part of the property only to be spotted seconds later on the opposite side. A child claimed to have seen him standing in the center of the frozen pond, his reflection absent from the ice. The sheriff made a casual visit, but when he met Luther, his demeanor shifted. He left without asking any questions, and Halberg later overheard him in town telling someone, "That's not a man you watch. That's a man you stay out of the way of." By May, the marks on Luther's body had fully connected, forming intricate geometric shapes that seemed to pulse faintly under the skin. Halberg took to sketching them during examinations, and only later realized the designs matched those on the strange books Luther had been reading. When he asked about the connection, Luther replied, "It's not a language, it's a map, and I'm almost finished." Halberg's notes from this period grew erratic, filled with crossed-out sentences and lines written in an unsteady hand. On one page, in the margins he had scrawled, "If he finishes, I will not remember enough to stop him." That entry was underlined 3 times. It was then that Eleanor, the maid, brought Halberg a piece of folded paper she claimed to have found in the ashes of the manor's fireplace. It contained one of the same strange symbols now etched into Luther's skin, drawn in a precise hand. Beneath it, in faint pencil, were the words, "Keep him from the attic." When Halberg asked about it, Eleanor refused to speak further, her eyes darting toward the ceiling as though she feared being overheard. That night, Halberg lay awake in his quarters at the inn, the symbol burned into his memory. He could not shake the image of the attic door, or the gnawing certainty that Luther had been spending more and more time up there. By the end of June, the oppressive tension in the Ashford estate had reached a breaking point. Every creak of the floorboards seemed deliberate, every shadow unnaturally still. Halberg knew that something in the attic, whether an object, a truth, or something far worse, was the key to whatever Luther was becoming. And yet he also knew that the closer he came to that door, the less likely he was to remember what he had been looking for. On the morning of July 3, 1863, Dr. Halberg arrived at the Ashford estate to find the front door already ajar. This was unusual. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, was meticulous about locking it, especially in recent months. The moment he stepped inside, a draft whispered down the hallway, carrying with it a faint scent of burnt cedar and something sharper. Ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. The house was silent, but not in the way an empty house is silent. This was the kind of silence that feels as though it's listening back. Halberg called out for Mrs. Finch, for Eleanor, for anyone, but no voice answered. As he moved deeper into the manor, he noticed something odd. The walls were bare. The family portraits, the paintings, even the mirrors, all gone. Only faint outlines remained on the wallpaper where they had hung. His footsteps echoed unnaturally in the open space, as though the house had been hollowed of more than just objects. In the dining room, the long oak table had been cleared except for one item placed dead center, a single leather-bound journal, the same kind Halberg used for his own notes. He opened it, expecting to find his own handwriting. Instead, every page was filled with Luther's elegant, precise script. At first, the entries resembled ordinary diary notes, weather reports, small details about the estate, but gradually the tone shifted. Luther began to refer to himself in the third person, as though observing from a distance. He will not need sleep much longer. He will remember everything soon. He will not be bound by the frame. The final entry simply read, "The attic is ready." Halberg's breath caught. The folded scrap of paper Eleanor had given him weeks earlier, warning to keep him from the attic, now pressed at the forefront of his mind. He closed the journal and made for the stairs, each step accompanied by a strange vibration in the wood, as if the house itself disapproved of his ascent. Halfway up, he froze. There was a sound above him, slow, deliberate footfalls moving in a circle. Then a pause. Then the faint creak of a door hinge. It wasn't the attic door, it was something inside the attic. Halberg forced himself to continue. At the landing, the hallway stretched out in both directions, dim despite the daylight outside. At the far end stood the narrow, unpainted attic door, a chain looped through its handle and secured with a small padlock. But the lock hung loose, unlatched. The chain swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. Halberg's hand trembled as he reached for it. He told himself it was just a room. Rooms had answers. Rooms could be catalogued, understood. But when he opened the door, the first thing he saw made the rational part of his mind falter. The attic was impossibly large, larger than the footprint of the entire house. It stretched outward and upward, rafters disappearing into shadow, and in the center, beneath a cone of pale light, stood Luther Ashford. He was barefoot, dressed in a simple white shirt and trousers. The geometric markings on his skin had expanded, connecting into a full lattice that ran from his neck to his ankles. They pulsed faintly, in rhythm with something unseen. Around him, the floorboards were carved with the same patterns, so deep that Halberg could see the raw wood beneath. And on the far wall, something was taking shape, a kind of relief, carved directly into the attic's structure, depicting an intricate map of interlocking circles and lines. "You weren't supposed to see this yet," Luther said without turning. His voice was calm, almost sympathetic. Halberg stepped forward, forcing his tone to remain steady. "What is this, Luther? What are you doing to yourself?" Luther finally turned to face him, and for the first time Halberg noticed that his eyes were no longer the pale blue of the Ashford line. They were black. Not the black of a dilated pupil, but a complete absence, as if his eyes were openings into some place where light could not exist. "I'm not doing this to myself," Luther said. "I'm finishing what was started long before you were born. Before I was born, before any of us were born here." Halberg's gaze flicked to the markings on the wall. "A map," he murmured. "Yes," Luther agreed, "but not of places, of states, phases, ways through the frame." Halberg tried to step closer, but the moment his foot crossed the carved patterns in the floor, a force like a pressure wave hit him square in the chest, stopping him cold. His breath caught, and for a heartbeat he could not move. Luther watched him, tilting his head slightly, as though studying a specimen. "You feel it," Luther said. "It doesn't want you inside. It knows you can't remember." Halberg's mind flashed with fragments, moments with Luther that he had forgotten until now. Phrases Luther had spoken in passing, dreams Halberg had dismissed, the faint sense of déjà vu whenever they met. The realization dawned with a sickening weight. It wasn't his mind failing. Something, or someone, had been erasing his memories selectively, keeping him from connecting the pieces. "Why me?" Halberg asked, his voice raw. Luther smiled faintly. "Because you're not afraid of what you can't explain. That makes you useful, until it doesn't." From the shadows at the far end of the attic, Halberg thought he saw movement. A ripple, as though the air itself had bent. For a fraction of a second, he glimpsed something beyond the wall. A vast, formless shape moving in a darkness deeper than night. The sight made his stomach lurch and his knees weaken. He staggered back toward the door, but Luther took a single step forward and the vibration in the floor intensified, pinning Halberg in place. "There's no going back now," Luther said softly. "You've seen enough to remember, but not enough to understand. That's the dangerous part." Halberg's pulse hammered in his ears. "What's in there, Luther? What's beyond this frame?" Instead of answering directly, Luther knelt and placed his hand flat against the carved floor. The markings beneath his palm flared, and a low hum filled the attic, resonating in Halberg's bones. The air grew heavy, and the shadows along the rafters seemed to stretch, reaching downward. "It's not what's beyond," Luther said, his voice now a whisper that still carried perfectly in the vast space. "It's what's returning." The temperature dropped sharply, frost spiderwebbing across the carved floorboards. Halberg's breath came in ragged puffs. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body would not obey. Luther's black eyes locked onto his, and for a moment Halberg felt something inside him shift, like a memory being unlocked, or perhaps replaced. Then, without warning, Luther released him. The force holding Halberg in place vanished, and he stumbled backward through the attic doorway, nearly falling down the stairs. The door swung shut behind him with a sound far louder than wood should make, and when he looked again, The padlock was back in place. Halberg didn't remember leaving the house. He didn't remember the road back to the inn. But when he awoke the next morning, sitting fully dressed in the chair by his desk, he found a piece of paper tucked into his breast pocket. On it, in Luther's precise handwriting, were 3 words: "It opens soon." Dr. Halberg spent the next several days in a fog that no amount of coffee or fresh air could lift. He attended to his patients with mechanical precision, his hands steady but his thoughts elsewhere, circling the attic, the markings, and the black void in Luther Ashford's eyes. Each night he tried to write down what had happened, but the sentences came out fractured, like recollections from a fevered dream. Sometimes, when he returned to the page the next morning, entire lines were missing, blanks where ink should have been, as though someone had erased them without touching the paper. By the 4th day, he resolved to confront Eleanor Ashford. If anyone in that house had both the will and the knowledge to explain Luther's transformation, it would be her. But when he arrived at the estate, Mrs. Finch met him at the door, pale and tight-lipped. "You shouldn't be here, Doctor," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "Where's Eleanor?" he demanded. "Gone," the housekeeper replied. "Packed her things the night after you came. Didn't say where. Only left this." She handed him an envelope, unsealed, containing a single folded sheet of stationery. In Eleanor's careful hand, the message was short. "I can't stay. He's too far along. Don't follow me. If you value your mind, don't look for me. But if you must, find Father Armitage in Boston. Tell him I sent you." Halberg read it twice, feeling both relief and dread. Eleanor was alive, but Boston was nearly 100 miles away, and travel would take days. Meanwhile, Luther was still here, still in that attic, still working on whatever opening he believed was coming. That night, as Halberg debated his next move, a knock came at his inn door. When he opened it, no one was there. Only a small wooden box sat on the floor, no markings or label. Inside, cushioned in dark velvet, lay an object unlike anything he had ever seen, a sphere of some pale, translucent material, no larger than a plum, threaded through with impossibly fine lines of silver that seemed to shift when he tilted it. Beneath the sphere was a card with 5 words in the same precise script as before: "For when the frame thins." Halberg held it up to the lamplight. The silver lines formed patterns that flickered between familiar and alien, shapes he half recognized from the attic carvings. But what unsettled him most was the faint warmth emanating from the sphere, a warmth that seemed to pulse in sync with his own heartbeat. Sleep was impossible. He sat awake until dawn, turning the sphere over in his hands, weighing the meaning of Luther's cryptic note. When the sun finally rose, he decided he would go to Boston. The journey was long and uneventful until the second night, when he stopped at a roadside inn outside Worcester. He had just settled into his room when he heard a soft tapping at the window. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and far too high for any person to reach from the ground. Cautiously, he approached. Through the glass, pressed against the pane from the outside, was a hand. It was slender, pale, and entirely too still. As Halberg stared, the fingers twitched once, then curled away. He threw the window open, but there was nothing. No ledge, no footprints in the dirt below, only the faint smell of cedar and ozone lingering in the air. By the time he reached Boston, he was sleeping in brief snatches, waking from dreams in which Luther's black eyes appeared inches from his face. Finding Father Armitage proved difficult. The man was not a parish priest but a scholar of theology and anomalous phenomena attached to a private society on Beacon Hill. When Halberg was finally admitted to his study, the old man wasted no time. "You've seen the markings," Armitage said without preamble. "And you've looked into his eyes. That means he's marked you as well. Halberg bristled. "Marked me? For what?" "To remember," Armitage replied grimly. "They mark so few, Doctor. Most they leave blind, unable to recall even the moment they're touched. But if you can remember, it means they expect you to be present when it happens." "When what happens?" "The return," Armitage said. "The opening of the frame. Luther Ashford is not possessed, nor is he mad. He is becoming. The lattice on his skin is a map, yes, but also a tether. Something on the other side needs him to finish it." Halberg told him about the sphere. At this, Armitage grew tense. If he sent you that, it means one of two things. Either he believes you can withstand what's coming, or he intends you to be the one who closes it, should he fail. The scholar rummaged through a stack of papers and produced a thin volume bound in cracked leather. Inside were sketches, diagrams of circles, intersecting lines, and repeating geometric shapes. Halberg recognized them immediately from the attic carvings. Beneath one drawing was a notation. "When the frame thins, the tethered may cross without return." "They've tried this before," Armitage said. "In other places, other centuries. Always with a tether, always with a guide on this side. But it never ends cleanly. The crossing doesn't just take them, it changes everything around the breach. People forget, or they remember too much and go mad. Sometimes both." Halberg felt a chill. "And you think Luther means to bring something through?" "I think," Armitage said slowly, "that it's already halfway here." He advised Halberg to destroy the sphere, but Halberg couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he kept it hidden in his coat pocket as he boarded the return train. On the journey back, he noticed subtle changes in the world outside the windows. Trees leaning at unnatural angles, shadows bending away from the sun, clouds that held their shape too long. Other passengers seemed not to notice. When he arrived in his town after nightfall, the streets were nearly empty. As he walked toward his inn, the church bell began to toll. 11 chimes, though it was only 8 by his watch. And with each chime, the air seemed to grow thicker, harder to breathe. By the time he reached his room, the sphere in his pocket was warm enough to burn his palm. He placed it on the desk, and the silver lines within it began to glow faintly, swirling faster and faster until they formed the unmistakable outline of the Ashford estate. Then, as he stared, the map shifted, showing not just the house but the attic, and in the center of the attic, Luther himself, standing exactly where Halberg had last seen him. Only now, something else loomed behind him, a silhouette too vast to fully perceive, its edges dissolving into the darkness above. A single thought forced itself into Halberg's mind, unbidden but certain. The frame was already thinning, and Luther Ashford was no longer entirely human. The following morning, Dr. Halberg awoke to find the sphere cold and inert on the desk, its silver lines still but somehow rearranged. The outline of the Ashford estate remained, yet the attic was gone, erased or hidden. In its place was a set of symbols he did not recognize, though one resembled a jagged spiral he had seen carved into the floorboards near Luther's chair. The air outside was unnervingly still, as though the entire town were holding its breath. Even the distant calls of morning birds were absent. Halberg dressed quickly and made his way toward the estate. As he approached, he noticed small changes. The iron gate hung slightly askew, and the once meticulously kept hedges were ragged, their leaves curling inward. The windows on the second floor were all covered from the inside, not with curtains but with nailed planks, as if to keep something from looking out. Or in, Mrs. Finch was nowhere to be found. The front door was unlocked, and the smell inside hit him instantly. Cedar, dust, and a faint trace of metal. The house was silent save for a distant creak somewhere above. He called out for Luther, for Mrs. Finch, but his voice felt swallowed by the air, absorbed before it could echo. He began to ascend the main staircase, his hand brushing the banister. The wood was warm, unnaturally so, as though the house itself had a fever. On the second floor, he found the door to the attic staircase wide open. This was unusual. Mrs. Finch had kept it locked for as long as he had known her. Now it yawned black before him. Halfway up the narrow steps, he noticed the symbols again. They had spread, across the risers, up the walls, onto the beams overhead. Some were carved deep, others painted in a dark, flaking pigment. The spiral appeared repeatedly, but now it seemed to pulse faintly, as though it were alive. When he reached the top, the attic was not as he remembered. The single chair remained, but it was pushed to the far wall. In its place, directly beneath the window, stood a frame. An actual wooden frame, perhaps 6 feet tall, empty but for a thin membrane stretched taut across it. The surface shimmered faintly, distorting the air like heat above a summer road. And Luther Ashford was there. He stood before the frame, his back to Hallberg, his hands tracing the silver lines in the air without touching them. His skin was nearly translucent now, the lattice of silver beneath it more pronounced, crawling slowly like frost spreading on glass. "Luther," Hallberg said, his voice unsteady. Luther turned. His eyes were not entirely black anymore. They glimmered with pinpoints of white light, like stars in a moonless sky. His smile was calm, almost kind. "You came," he said. "I wasn't sure you would." "What is this?" Hallberg demanded, nodding toward the frame. "The threshold," Luther replied. "It's thinner now. I've prepared it so they can step through cleanly, but it must be guided or it will tear." Hallberg felt the sphere in his coat grow warm again. "And what happens if it tears?" Luther's smile faltered. "Then this place will remember everything it has forgotten, and you won't survive the remembering." Hallberg stepped closer, the sphere heavy in his pocket. "You gave me this," he said. "Why?" "To give you a choice," Luther said softly. "You can help me guide them through, keep the frame intact, and remain untouched, or you can use it to collapse the frame and undo me in the process." Hallberg hesitated. "Undo you?" "They won't leave me whole," Luther said. "I'm already too far along. But if you collapse the frame, you sever the tether. I will go with them and the breach will close, and you will never know for certain what was on the other side." A faint hum filled the attic now, resonating in Hallberg's bones. The membrane in the frame rippled, and shadows began to move on its surface, shapes with limbs that bent at impossible angles, their outlines shifting with each breath. "Why you?" Hallberg asked. "Why were you chosen?" Luther's gaze drifted past him to the narrow attic window. "Because I saw them first. I remembered when no one else could. And they remembered me." The hum deepened, and the air grew thick. Hallberg realized the symbols carved into the floor were glowing faintly, their light running in channels toward the base of the frame. The shapes behind the membrane pressed closer, their forms growing clearer. Hands, faces, eyes without lids. "Time's nearly gone," Luther said. "Decide." Hallberg's hand closed around the sphere. It was almost too hot to hold, and he could feel a faint vibration inside it, like a heartbeat. He imagined crushing it, imagined the sound the frame might make as it tore, the silence that would follow. He imagined Luther's face vanishing into the dark. But another thought intruded, one far more dangerous. What if Luther was right? What if guiding them through meant preserving something even more fragile than his own safety? What if collapse brought not closure, but chaos? The membrane trembled violently now, the shapes pushing against it as though testing its strength. The hum rose to a pitch that made his teeth ache. Luther stepped aside, gesturing to the frame. "It's your choice, Doctor. Help me, or end me." Halberg stared into the shifting void, his mind a war of logic and instinct. The sphere pulsed once, twice, then went cold. The light from the symbols flickered, as though the house itself was holding its breath for his decision. He took one step toward the frame. Luther's expression didn't change, but his hands moved subtly, tracing the air as though preparing for either outcome. Another step. The shapes were so close now that Halberg could see the texture of their skin, like wet stone, glistening, ridged. He raised the sphere. The attic door slammed behind him,